August 1896, the Jersey Lily Saloon, Langtry, Texas. A man stands trial for murder before Judge Roy Bean. The dead man was Chinese, a railroad worker with $40 in his pocket. Bean searched his law book theatrically, then dismissed the case with a racist justification, claiming he found no law protecting Chinese railroad workers. Case dismissed. Court costs. $40. Exactly what the dead man was carrying. The law west of the Pecos was whatever Roy Bean said it was, and justice meant whatever turned a profit. Here's what nobody tells you. The Wild West's most famous judge couldn't read half the laws he was enforcing. His courthouse served more whiskey than warrants. Roy Bean wasn't some colourful character. He was on the Southern Pacific Railroad's payroll, dealing with troublesome workers through legal theatre. This isn't a story about frontier justice. It's about America's first franchise of privatized brutality, where Hollywood saw a lovable rogue. History should see a drunk who hanged innocents for bar money. If you're drawn to history's darker corners, where justice was just another commodity for sale, consider subscribing. Now take a slow, deep breath, settle in, and let me tell you how one man turned law into theatre and corruption into legend, and how America celebrated him for it. The Jersey Lily Saloon squatted beside the railroad tracks like a sun-baked toad, its unpainted boards warped and twisted from decades of desert heat and occasional flash floods. Step inside on any given afternoon and the first thing that hit you wasn't the heat, though that pressed against you like a living thing, but the smell. Decades of spilled beer had soaked into the floorboards until they'd gone soft in places, sticky everywhere, releasing a sweet sour reek that mixed with tobacco juice, sweat, and something else. Something that might have been desperation, or might have just been the outhouse too close to the kitchen. The bar itself ran the length of the north wall, scarred wood that had seen 10,000 bottles slammed down in anger or celebration, or just the desperate need for oblivion that drove men to places like Langtry, Texas. Behind it, shelves held bottles of whiskey that claimed to be from Kentucky but tasted like they'd been distilled in someone's bathtub, which they probably had. The beer came warm unless you paid extra for cold, and paying extra meant whatever Bean decided that day. Might be $1, might be $5, might be whatever you had in your pockets that he could see when you reached for your wallet. But the real centerpiece, the thing that transformed this frontier dive into something altogether stranger, hung behind what Bean called his bench. The portrait of Lily Langtry dominated the room with the serene gaze of someone who had no idea she was presiding over trials that ended in hanging, divorces that weren't legal, and business deals that would have made a Barbary Coast pirate blush. She was beautiful in that Victorian way, all corseted perfection and impossible skin. The kind of woman who existed in gaslight and grease paint but would wilt in the Texas sun like a hothouse flower. Bean had paid a travelling artist $50, a fortune then, to paint her portrait from a newspaper photograph. The artist, drunk on Bean's whiskey and sensing opportunity, had given her eyes that seemed to follow you around the room. Those painted eyes watched everything. The rigged trials, the forced drinking, the men who stumbled in looking for justice and stumbled out having found something else entirely. This wasn't just a saloon, and it wasn't just a courthouse. It was a machine designed to separate men from their money while maintaining the fiction that law existed west of the Pecos River. The business model was elegantly corrupt. A trial would be called, usually for whoever had offended Bean that week or whoever the railroad wanted dealt with. The defendant would be hauled in, sometimes literally, and seated before Bean's barrel bench. The jury would be selected from whoever was already drinking at the bar, which meant they were already in Bean's debt for their liquor. Then came the genius part. Throughout the trial, the jury was encouraged, required really, to keep drinking. Every round meant more debt to Bean. Every drink meant less clarity about the actual law. By the time deliberations came, most juries were too drunk to remember the defendant's name, much less the alleged crime. They'd vote however Bean's bartender suggested, which was however Bean had already decided. The defendant, meanwhile, faced a choice that wasn't a choice at all. Buy rounds for the jury and maybe get acquitted, or refuse and definitely get convicted. Most paid. The smart ones paid quickly and generously. The poor ones, well, Bean had a solution for them too. Guilty verdicts came with fines that mysteriously matched whatever the defendant had on them, down to the last cent. But the trials were just part of the performance. The real money came from the monopolies. Bean controlled the only saloon for 100 miles in any direction. The only cold beer between San Antonio and El Paso. The only legal authority in a territory the size of some eastern states. The Lily Langtry obsession had started simply enough. Bean had seen her photograph in a newspaper, probably the San Antonio Express, sometime in 1882. She was appearing in New York, wearing a dress that cost more than most men in Langtry would see in their lifetimes. Something about her, maybe the impossibility of her, the sheer distance between her world and his, captured what passed for Bean's imagination. He wrote her letters, long rambling things filled with desert philosophy and marriage proposals, though he had a wife somewhere back east he'd abandoned decades ago. He told her about the town he'd renamed for her, though the railroad claimed they'd named it for a foreman named Langtry. Bean had his version and stuck to it with the tenacity of a man who'd learned that reality was negotiable if you were the one holding the gun. The letters were never sent. They piled up in a box behind the bar, yellowing testimonies to an obsession that had curdled into something darker. Instead, Bean built his shrine, behind the saloon, in a room that reeked of mesquite smoke and old leather. He'd covered the walls with newspaper clippings about her performances, her scandals, her marriages, pressed flowers, desert wildflowers that looked nothing like anything that would bloom in London, were tacked between the articles. A lock of hair that he claimed was hers but was actually cut from a Mexican prostitute who'd passed through town sat in a glass case like a holy relic. Late at night, after the saloon closed and the last drunk had been rolled for his pockets and dumped in the street, Bean would sit in that room with a bottle of his better whiskey, the stuff he didn't sell to customers. He'd talk to the clippings, to the flowers, to the lock of hair that wasn't hers. He'd tell Lily about his day, about the trials, about the men he'd fined or freed or sent to the gallows out back. The conversations were one-sided, but in Bean's whiskey-soaked mind, she answered. She understood. She approved. She was coming to visit any day now, and when she did, she'd see what he'd built for her. This town, this temple, this empire of dust and delusion. The Southern Pacific Railroad, meanwhile, saw something else entirely in Roy Bean. The perfect tool. The railroad had a problem. They were pushing through some of the most lawless territory in America, using workers they considered entirely disposable. Chinese immigrants, Mexican nationals, Irish who'd fled famine only to find the desert. These men had a tendency to cause trouble. They wanted their pay. They wanted water that didn't taste like alkali. They wanted not to die in industrial accidents that could have been prevented if anyone gave a damn. Enter Roy Bean, Justice of the Peace, appointed by the railroad's bought judges back in San Antonio. They didn't need him to know the law. They needed him to know which side his bread was buttered on. Every troublemaker Bean dealt with was worth $25 to him, paid quietly through intermediaries, logged in ledgers that would conveniently burn in a fire years later. The arrangement was perfect. The railroad got their enforcer, Bean got his authority and his income. The workers got nothing but the understanding that complaining might mean a trial in the Jersey Lily, and nobody walked away from one of those with anything but empty pockets and bruised ribs. If they walked away at all, this was the birth of something new in America. Not frontier justice, which at least pretended to fairness, but corporate justice, where the law was whatever kept the profits flowing and the workers scared. Bean was the prototype. the beta test for every company town that would follow, every place where the boss owned the store, the houses, the police, and the judges. The trials themselves were masterpieces of theatrical corruption. Take the case of one Miguel Santos, a tracklayer accused of stealing company tools, a hammer and some railroad spikes worth maybe $2. Santos stood where the Chinese man had stood months before, hat in hand, confusion written across his weathered face. He spoke maybe 10 words of English, and none of them were legal terms. Bean appointed him a defense attorney, the town drunk, who was unconscious at a corner table and would remain so throughout the proceedings. The prosecution began with Bean himself taking the stand, swearing himself in with his left hand on his law book and his right raised toward Lily's portrait. He testified that tools were missing, that Santos worked for the railroad, and that these two facts were obviously connected. When it came time for cross-examination, Bean walked around his barrel bench and, as defense attorney, asked himself if he was sure. As witness, he confirmed he was. Case closed. But Santos had been warned. He'd scraped together $12, borrowed from fellow workers who knew that there, but for the grace of God and Bean's attention, went they. As the jury stumbled toward deliberation, Santos's money hit the bar. "Drinks for the gentlemen of the jury," the bartender announced, and suddenly the deliberation took a different turn. 3 rounds later, the verdict came back, guilty of the lesser charge of thinking about stealing. Fine, $12, court costs, the hammer and spikes he'd been accused of stealing, which Bean would sell back to the railroad next week. Santos left with his life and his empty pockets, which in Bean's court counted as a victory. And looming over it all, watching with those painted eyes that saw everything and understood nothing, was Lily Langtry, the actress who'd never heard of Roy Bean, whose image presided over a kingdom of grift and violence and loneliness so profound it had taken physical form as a town in the middle of nowhere, named for a love that existed only in one man's diseased imagination. The Jersey Lily Saloon wasn't just a bar or a courthouse. It was America's future wearing its past like a disguise. Corporate power dressed up in frontier mythology, waiting to spread across the nation like spilled whiskey soaking into soft wood, leaving stains that would never come clean. Bean's law book was a masterpiece of creative interpretation. The 1879 revised statutes of Texas had seen better days, most of them before Roy Bean got his hands on it. Pages were missing, torn out during fits of rage or used as kindling on cold desert nights. Water stains, or whiskey stains, or both, had warped the remaining pages into rippled landscapes of barely legible text. The margins were filled with Bean's own annotations, scrawled in pencil when sober, in charcoal when drunk, sometimes in what appeared to be blood but was probably just barbecue sauce. He kept it on his barrel bench like a prop. This destroyed testament to law and order. During trials, he'd flip through it with the theatrical flair of a Shakespeare actor who'd forgotten his lines but refused to leave the stage. His thick fingers would trace passages that didn't exist, cite statutes he'd invented on the spot, quote California law in Texas because, as he'd say, what was good enough for California ought to be good enough for Texas. And if it wasn't, well, it should be. The truth was, Bean could barely read. He'd learnt his letters late and poorly, and the complex legal language might as well have been ancient Greek. But he'd discovered something more valuable than literacy. If you spoke with enough authority, if you slammed that book down hard enough, if you glared at anyone who questioned your interpretation, then the law became whatever you said it was. Take the ice beer monopoly. Bean controlled the only source of cold beer for 100 miles in any direction. The ice came by train, packed in sawdust, precious as gold in the desert heat. Picture a July afternoon. The thermometer reads 115 in the shade, if you could find shade. A railroad worker named O'Brien stumbles through the saloon doors, his throat so dry he can barely speak. He's been laying track since dawn, his water ration exhausted by noon. The metal rails so hot they've burned through his gloves. The Jersey Lily is dark after the blazing sun outside. It takes O'Brien's eyes a moment to adjust, to see Bean behind the bar, polishing a glass with theatrical slowness. The ice cellar door stands behind him, padlocked, guarded by a man with a shotgun who hasn't moved in so long he might be dead or might be sleeping in this heat. It's hard to tell the difference. O'Brien croaks out a single word, beer. His voice sounds like sandpaper on wood. Bean pours one from the tap. It's the temperature of blood, with roughly the same appeal. $1, he announces, setting the glass on the bar with a deliberate thud. O'Brien looks at the warm beer, foam already dissipating in the heat. He can see his own reflection in the amber surface, warped and desperate. He manages another word, a question. Cold? Bean's smile is the expression of a man holding 4 aces and watching his opponent go all in. $5, he says. The words hang in the air like a death sentence. $5, a week's wages, for 1 beer. O'Brien has $3.70 to his name. He lays it on the bar with shaking hands. Bean looks at the money like it's personally insulted him. He repeats his price. $5. No credit. No exceptions. The law of supply and demand, enforced at gunpoint. O'Brien explains that's all he has until payday, his voice breaking on the last word. Bean's response is as predictable as the sunrise and twice as harsh. Then he has warm beer money. O'Brien drinks the warm beer. It goes down like liquid disappointment, providing moisture but no relief. He can hear the ice settling in the cellar, creaking and sighing like something alive. The guard shifts his shotgun. Bean goes back to polishing his glass. When a German immigrant named Schultz tried to open a competing saloon, Bean found a statute, or claimed he found one, that made it illegal to sell alcohol within 500 feet of a courthouse. The fact that his courthouse was also a saloon? That irony was lost on no one, but Bean had the badge and the gun, and in Langtry, that was all the legal precedent you needed. Schultz tried anyway. His beer was just as warm, but he charged fair prices. For 3 days, he had customers. On the 4th day, Bean held a trial. The defendant was Schultz's beer supply, which Bean charged with being a public nuisance. The beer couldn't defend itself. Found guilty, the entire supply was confiscated and destroyed, though most of it was destroyed by being drunk by Bean and his jury. The divorce racket was even better. Bean had no authority to grant divorces. Hell, he barely had authority to perform marriages. But that didn't stop him. $10, and he'd declare you divorced, no questions asked. Another $5, and he'd marry you to someone else on the spot. Years later, when some of these couples discovered they'd been living in accidental bigamy, Bean was long past caring. He had a philosophy about it. Marriage was a contract. Divorce was breaking a contract, and he was the law. The logic was circular as a snake eating its tail, but try arguing that with a man who kept a loaded shotgun under his bench. But it was the corpse economics where Bean showed real innovation. The Southern Pacific Railroad had a problem with bodies, workers who died on the job, drifters who got themselves killed in fights, the occasional suicide. Bodies were bad for business, investigations were worse, and paperwork was worst of all. Bean's solution was elegant in its corruption. He'd hold posthumous trials, charging corpses with vagrancy, disturbing the peace, or whatever crime seemed most profitable. The dead couldn't defend themselves, which made conviction rates impressive. Fines were extracted from whatever the corpse had on it. Money, watches, boots, even gold teeth if Bean was feeling industrious. One time, he tried a dead man for carrying a concealed weapon, the gun that had killed him, still in his rigor mortis grip. Found guilty, fined $50. The dead man's brother came looking for the body and the belongings. Bean showed him the court records, all official looking with a seal he'd carved himself from a potato. The brother left empty-handed, and Bean sold the gun to a passing cowboy for drinking money. This was frontier justice stripped of even the pretense of justice. It was commerce wearing a badge, capitalism with a six-shooter, a free market freed from the burden of conscience or consequence. Behind the Jersey Lily, past the outhouse and the pile of empty bottles that glittered like broken promises in the sun, stood the gallows. Bean had built it himself, or rather, he'd forced a convicted carpenter to build it in exchange for a reduced sentence. The wood was already weathered grey when it went up, salvage from an abandoned homestead where dreams had died of thirst. The rope hung there even when not in use, twisting slowly in the desert wind like a question mark against the sky. The hanging of the horse thief who wasn't a horse thief became Bean's most famous mistake, though calling it a mistake implies accident where there was only indifference. The morning of November 3rd, 1898, dawned grey and unseasonably cold. Carlos Monte had spent his last night in what Bean called a jail, really just a converted chicken coop behind the saloon, where the smell of old bird droppings mixed with the newer scent of human desperation. He'd been given no last meal, no priest, no chance to write a letter home. His crime, according to Bean's court, was being seen near some horses. His real crime was being Mexican in a town where that was enough. A crowd had gathered by 10 o'clock. Some rode in from distant ranches, bringing their children to see frontier justice in action. Women packed lunch baskets. Men passed flasks. Someone was selling roasted peanuts for a nickel a bag. They brought Montes out at noon. He wore the same clothes he'd been arrested in. A faded blue shirt, canvas pants worn through at the knees, boots that had walked too many miles. His hands were tied behind his back with rope that cut into his wrists, leaving red marks that would never heal. Bean read the charges from his position on the gallows, his voice carrying across the crowd with the practiced projection of a carnival barker. Horse theft, he announced, though no horses had been presented as evidence. The defendant has been found guilty by a jury of his peers. Here he gestured to 12 men who were already drunk, though the sun hadn't reached its apex, and sentenced to hang by the neck until dead. Montes tried to speak. He said, in broken English, that he had a wife, 2 daughters, that he'd never stolen anything in his life. His words were swallowed by the crowd's anticipation. Someone told him to shut up. Someone else threw a bottle that shattered against the gallows post, sending brown glass across the platform like broken promises. Bean positioned him on the trapdoor, the noose, woven from good hemp rope that had been used 3 times before, settled around his neck with the weight of finality. Montes's legs shook. A wet stain spread across the front of his pants. The crowd laughed. Bean asked if he had any last words, though his hand was already reaching for the lever. Montes looked directly at Lily Langtry's portrait, which someone had brought out and propped against the gallows for the occasion. His voice came steady now, as if addressing her painted eyes gave him strength. He declared his innocence, said that God knew, she knew. They all knew the truth of it. His words were swallowed by the crowd's anticipation, but they hung in the air for those who would remember. Bean pulled the lever. The trapdoor opened with a bang that sent the crowd's children crying to their mothers. What happened next took less than a minute, though the memory would last lifetimes. The crowd went silent, then some looked away. Others couldn't. When it was over, there was only stillness, except for the slow rotation of the rope, turning the body first toward the crowd, then away, then back again, like he was looking for someone who wasn't there. They left him hanging for 3 hours, until the crowd dispersed and the peanut vendor ran out of stock. When they finally cut him down, his body fell like a sack of grain, heavy and graceless. They buried him in an unmarked grave outside the town cemetery, because even in death, some people mattered less than others. 3 days later, the real horse thief was caught in San Antonio with the horses in question, 3 roans with distinctive white markings that several witnesses could identify. Word reached Langtry by telegraph. The bartender, thinking Bean would want to know, brought him the message while he was holding court on another matter. Bean read the telegraph, crumpled it up, and tossed it into the spittoon. "Well," he said, not missing a beat in his current trial, "Montes was guilty of something, or he wouldn't have been in my court." The widow came 2 weeks later. Maria Montes had walked 40 miles from their homestead, her feet bloody in worn shoes, carrying her husband's death certificate. If you could call Bean's scrawled note on Jersey Lily letterhead a certificate, she wanted his body, she wanted an apology, she wanted justice. Bean fined her $5 for contempt of court when she raised her voice. When she couldn't pay, he gave her a choice: 3 days in jail or leave town immediately. She left, walking back the same 40 miles, carrying nothing but the knowledge that her husband's grave was somewhere in the desert, unmarked and unmourned except by the coyotes that came at night. But the gallows wasn't just for hanging. Bean had other uses for it, creative applications of terror that would have impressed medieval inquisitors. There was the rescue for ransom scheme, where defendants would stand on the gallows with the noose around their neck while their families scrambled to raise money for the fine. The amount would mysteriously increase based on how much the family appeared to be gathering. Sometimes the rescue came too late. Accidents. Bean called them, though his regret lasted exactly as long as it took to count the money. Then there were the bear fights. Bean kept a black bear named Bruno chained behind the saloon, fed on scraps and spite. When a verdict was unclear, which meant when Bean was too drunk to decide, defendants could choose trial by combat. Fight the bear. Win, you're innocent. Lose, you're guilty posthumously. One fight in particular became legend, September 1899, and the defendant was a drifter accused of cheating at cards. The crowd was the biggest yet, maybe 200 people, cramming into the space behind the Jersey Lily, standing on boxes and barrels for a better view. Bean sold tickets at $5 each, stationed at the entrance with a cash box and a pistol. The pit was 15 feet across, surrounded by a fence made of salvage railroad ties. The ground was packed dirt, stained dark from previous fights. Bruno waited in the centre, 200 pounds of muscle and rage, his black fur matted with dust. The chain around his neck had worn the fur away, leaving a ring of raw pink skin that wept constantly. The drifter, name of Coleman, though Bean just called him the cheater, stepped into the pit wearing only his pants and boots. His chest, pale as a fish belly except where the sun had burned his arms and neck, heaved with desperate breathing. The contradicting advice he'd received swirled in his head like whiskey. Bruno stood on his hind legs, 7 feet tall, his breath visible in the morning air, smelling of rotten meat and wildness. The crowd went silent. The fight lasted 3 minutes. 3 minutes that those who watched would never forget, though most wished they could. The bear was swift and decisive. The first swipe left Coleman wounded and desperate. The second attack left permanent damage. Coleman went down immediately, and Bruno was on him with all the fury of a wild animal forced into performance. Bean let it continue for 30 seconds that felt like hours before firing his pistol in the air. Men with long poles prodded Bruno back to his corner. Coleman lay in the dirt, barely conscious, clearly defeated. Someone dragged him out by his boots, leaving a dark trail in the dust. He survived, minus pieces of himself he'd never get back, an ear, fingers, dignity, and any desire to ever play cards again. Bean declared him innocent by survival, but guilty of making a mess in the pit. Fine, $50 for cleanup costs. When Coleman couldn't pay, Bean took his boots, his belt, and the silver dollar he'd sewn into the lining of his pants for luck. Bruno's record stood at 12-3. The 3 who survived did so missing pieces that would never grow back, carrying scars that would never fade. Bean counted these as acquittals, though the men usually left town immediately, preferring whatever justice they might find elsewhere to another day in Bean's jurisdiction. The political corruption ran deeper than the Rio Grande in flood season. Come election time, Bean voted early and often, not just for himself, but for every corpse who'd passed through his court. Dead men voted reliably in Langtry, their political opinions surprisingly aligned with whoever was paying Bean that particular season. When questioned about voters who'd been deceased for years, Bean argued they'd been residents when they died, and death shouldn't disenfranchise a citizen. The fact that these citizens voted exactly as Bean directed was, he insisted, coincidence. Lily Langtry never wrote back. Oh, she responded once, through her publicist, a form letter thanking dear admirer for their interest and mentioning that signed photographs were available for purchase. Bean framed that letter like it was a love sonnet, hung it in his shrine room next to the pressed desert flowers and the newspaper clippings that chronicled a life lived an ocean away from his own. The shrine room was 8 feet by 10 feet of concentrated madness, hidden behind a door marked private in the back of the Jersey Lily. Step inside, and the temperature dropped 5 degrees. Bean had insulated the walls with newspapers, layer upon layer of them, creating a cocoon of yellowing print. The smell hit you first, old paper and whiskey and something else. Something like flowers left too long in a tomb. Every inch of wall space was covered, newspaper clippings, overlapping like scales on a fish, told Lily's story in fragments. Langtry triumphs in New York. The Jersey Lily dazzles London. Scandalous affair rocks British society. Bean had annotated them in pencil, his handwriting deteriorating as you moved chronologically through the collection, from neat cursive to drunken scrawls. Between the clippings were pressed flowers, desert wildflowers that looked like they'd been tortured into flatness. Prickly pear blossoms, their pink faded to the colour of old blood. Desert marigolds, brown now, crackling if you breathed on them too hard. Each one labelled with when he'd picked it and what he'd been thinking of her that day. The centrepiece was the lock of hair in its glass case, positioned on a shelf like a religious relic. Black hair, thick and lustrous. Nothing like Lily Langtry's famous auburn waves. Bean had bought it from a Mexican prostitute named Isabella for $20 and a promise not to prosecute her for solicitation. In his mind, through the whiskey's alchemy, it had transformed into Lily's hair, cut from her head and sent to him as a token of affection. Late at night, after the saloon closed and the last drunk had been rolled for his pockets and dumped in the street, Bean would lock himself in this room with a bottle of the good whiskey, the stuff he hid from customers. He'd light the oil lamp, adjusting the wick until Lily's pictures seemed to move in the flickering light. He'd talk to her then, tell her about his day, about the trials, about the men he'd fined or freed or hanged. He'd recite poetry, badly remembered Byron, mangled Shakespeare, his own compositions that rhymed Lily with freely and purely and once, memorably, really. The letters he wrote but never sent piled up in a wooden box beneath the hair shrine. Some were 20 pages long, confessions that started coherent and dissolved into stream of consciousness, rambling about destiny and desire and the desert stars. Others were single sentences. I killed a man today in your name. The town is yours. Come to me. As the years wore on and the whiskey took its toll and the letters became stranger, he began to write as if she were already there with him, describing conversations they'd had, meals they'd shared, quiet moments watching the desert sunset from the porch of the Jersey Lily. In his mind, she understood him. She saw past the rough exterior to the romantic soul beneath. She was coming to visit, always coming, delayed by tours or other obligations, but surely, any day now, stepping off that train. The forced performances in her honour were acts of worship that bordered on torture. Before any trial could begin, Defendants were required to recite poetry about Lily Langtry's beauty. Bean had a preferred verse, copied from a magazine and modified with his own additions. A terrible piece of doggerel that proclaimed her fair as morning dew, praised her eyes, which he insisted were blue though they were brown, her grace so true, and declared that in Langtry, Texas, everyone loved her. One defendant, a cowhand named Thompson, made the mistake of laughing during the recitation. Bean held him in contempt and devised a special punishment. Thompson would stand in the noon sun and recite love poetry for 6 hours straight, or until he collapsed, whichever came first. They propped him against a post in the middle of the street. No shade, no water. Bean sat in a chair on the saloon porch, drinking cold beer and correcting Thompson's pronunciation. He'd shout for more volume, more feeling, demanding Thompson perform like his life depended on it, which, in Bean's jurisdiction, it very well might. By hour 3, Thompson's voice had gone to a whisper. By hour 4, he was mouthing words with no sound. By hour 5, he was unconscious, still standing only because they tied him to the post. Bean declared the contempt purged and had him dragged to the edge of town. Thompson was found 3 days later, wandering the desert, reciting Shakespearean sonnets to the cacti. The jury was required to toast her portrait before rendering any verdict. "To the Jersey Lily," they'd mumble, raising their glasses to those painted eyes that never blinked, never judged, never looked away from whatever degradation was performed in their presence. But by 1902, the world was changing faster than Bean could drink it away. The Southern Pacific Railroad had moved its operations further west. The workers followed, and with them went the steady stream of defendants and drinking customers that had kept the Jersey Lily profitable. Langtry began its slow transformation from a town to a ghost town with residents. Bean's drinking, always prodigious, became legendary. He'd start with whiskey at sunrise and work his way through whatever was behind the bar by sunset. His trials, once at least theatrical in their corruption, became incoherent farces. He'd forget what crime was being tried halfway through. Convict men for offences they hadn't been charged with, or sometimes acquit the prosecutor by mistake. The end came in March 1903. Bean had been drinking for 3 days straight, a bender that started as celebration. He'd received news that Lily Langtry was touring America, and ended as it always did, with Bean face down in his own bar, mumbling to ghosts. His bartender found him behind the Jersey Lily on March 16th, collapsed by the bear cage. Whether he'd been trying to feed Bruno or fight him was unclear. The bear, chained and indifferent, barely looked up. Bean was muttering about Lily, about the train that was coming, about the town he'd built for her. He died before the doctor arrived, though the doctor was also the veterinarian and the dentist, so medical intervention might not have helped anyway. His last words, according to the bartender who was definitely not above embellishing for free drinks, were, "Tell her I waited." 6 months after Roy Bean died, Lily Langtry finally came to the town that bore her name, October 1903, and her private train, provided by the Southern Pacific Railroad for what they called publicity purposes, announced itself with a whistle that echoed across the desert like a ghost promise finally kept. Steam hissed from the engine, momentarily obscuring the platform where half the remaining population of Langtry had gathered. They'd been waiting since dawn. These 30 or so souls who still called this dying town home. She emerged from her private car like a vision from another world, which she was. Her travelling dress, blue silk that caught the morning light, probably cost more than the entire town's annual income. She moved with the practiced grace of someone always aware of being watched, her steps measured, her smile professional, her skin, protected by parasols and expensive creams, seemed to glow with an otherworldly pallor next to the sun-scorched faces of the locals. The railroad had briefed her, of course. They told her about the colourful judge who'd named the town for her, the devoted fan who died 6 months prior. They'd mentioned he kept her portrait in his saloon. They hadn't mentioned the shrine room with its pressed flowers and stolen hair. They hadn't described the forced poetry recitations or the trials conducted beneath her painted gaze. They certainly hadn't explained that her image had presided over hangings, that men had died looking at her face. The photographers were already set up, 2 from San Antonio, 1 from Houston, their cameras on tripods like mechanical spiders. They directed her to Bean's grave, a mound of dirt that had already begun to settle, marked with a wooden cross that would be replaced with marble after her visit generated the expected publicity. She stood beside the grave in careful poses, hand to heart, head bowed in reflection. Placing a bouquet of roses brought from San Antonio, nothing local would doom the packed earth. The photographer's flash powder exploded in puffs of smoke, capturing her performance of grief for a man she'd never met, whose letters she'd never read, whose obsession she'd been blessed to never fully understand. When asked by the local reporter, she offered the expected platitudes, called Bean a great admirer, expressed how touched she was by his devotion. The words fell from her lips with practiced ease, meaning nothing, costing nothing. They brought her to the Jersey Lily then. Someone had attempted to clean it for her visit, but decades of spilled beer and blood don't wash out easily. The smell hit her as she entered, stale alcohol and something else. Something she couldn't identify but that made her want to breathe through her mouth. Her expression never changed. She was an actress, after all. She stood before her portrait, that painting that had watched over so much cruelty and corruption. The artist had given her eyes that seemed to follow you, and now the real Lily and the painted Lily regarded each other across the gap between myth and reality. She pronounced it a fair likeness, though the painting looked nothing like her. The portrait showed a woman frozen in the 1880s. The real Lily had aged 20 years since then, though she wore it well. Lines around her eyes that the portrait would never have. A slight softness to her jaw that spoke of good living and the passage of time. They didn't show her the shrine room. The bartender had locked it, hidden the key. Some things were too true to share with their subject. She toured the rest of the saloon with the practiced interest of someone who'd visited 1,000 provincial venues. She touched Bean's bench, the barrel he'd sat behind while dispensing his version of justice, and called it rustic, the word carrying just enough condescension to wound but not enough to quote. She admired the view from the porch, though the view was nothing but desert and railroad tracks stretching toward possibilities that Langtry would never reach. The whole visit lasted 3 hours. By noon, she was back on her train, the photographers packing their equipment, the reporters scribbling their stories about the actress and the judge, Beauty and the Beast, civilization and the frontier. The train pulled away with another shriek of steam, disappearing into the desert like it had never been there at all. The locals stood on the platform watching until even the smoke dissipated. Then they walked back to their dying town, past the Jersey Lily where her portrait still hung, past the gallows slowly being reclaimed by the desert, past the unmarked graves of men whose names nobody remembered, because Hollywood loved Roy Bean's story, or rather, they loved what they could make of it. The life and times of Judge Roy Bean in 1972 turned him into Paul Newman, handsome and roguish, dispensing folksy wisdom between adventures. The gallows became a comic prop. The corruption became colourful eccentricity. The dead Chinese railroad worker from the opening scene, he disappeared entirely from the story, as invisible in myth as he'd been in Bean's court. This is what America does with its monsters. It turns them into characters. It transforms exploitation into entertainment, brutality into local colour, systematic oppression into quirky frontier justice. The company town template Bean had pioneered would spread across America. Pullman, Illinois, Kohler, Wisconsin, Hershey, Pennsylvania, each one a kingdom where the company owned the stores, the houses, the police, and the judges. But we remember Bean as a character, not as a prototype for privatized oppression. The real legacy lived in the families destroyed by his arbitrary justice, in the workers who learned that the law was whatever the company said it was, in the precedent that justice could be bought, sold, and franchised like any other commodity. Today, the Jersey Lily still stands, transformed into a tourist attraction. Visitors photograph the bar where men were condemned, the barrel that served as a bench, the spot where the gallows stood. They buy postcards with Bean's image, the myth sanitized into souvenir form. Lily Langtry's portrait still hangs on the wall, those painted eyes still watching, still seeing nothing. The tourists stand before it and take selfies, adding their own images to the layers of performance that have accumulated like dust in the corners. Nobody mentions the men who were forced to worship this portrait before being sentenced to death. Nobody asks about the families who sought justice and found only theatre. In the visitors' centre, they sell cold beer. Craft beer now, imported from Austin, priced for tourists rather than railroad workers. $5 a bottle, same as Bean charged for cold beer in 1896, though the irony is lost on most. The story they tell is Hollywood's version. Colourful, eccentric, safely dead. Judge Roy Bean, the law west of the Pecos, the man who loved Lily Langtry, the character who dispensed frontier justice with a wink and a smile. But at night, when the tourists have gone and the desert wind picks up, you can still hear it, the creak of rope against wood, the clink of chains, the sound of money changing hands in exchange for justice. The real Roy Bean wasn't a character, he was a symptom, a prototype, a warning written in the Texas dust about what happens when the law becomes just another business to be franchised. Bean died waiting for a woman who would never come. She came waiting for a photo opportunity that would fade by next week's papers, and somewhere in the gap between those two performances, the truth got buried, that the Old West's most famous judge was just another drunk with a badge, and the law west of the Pecos was just another word for whatever kept the money flowing. The Jersey Lily Saloon stands today as a monument to America's talent for myth-making, for transforming its worst impulses into its most beloved stories. Every tourist who walks through those doors, every photograph taken beneath Lily Langtry's portrait, adds another layer to the lie. The building remembers everything, the trials, the hangings, the bribes, the deaths, but its memory has been rewritten, edited for comfort, sanitized for consumption. This is how history becomes legend, not through forgetting, but through deliberate remembering of the wrong things. We remember Bean's love for Lily Langtry, but not the men who died beneath her portrait. We remember the quirky trials, but not the families destroyed by them. We remember the colourful frontier judge, but not the corporate template he created. Roy Bean gave America exactly what it wanted, a way to privatize justice while keeping the mythology of frontier fairness intact. He showed corporations that they could own not just the means of production, but the means of justice itself. He proved that law was just another commodity to be bought, sold, and branded, and perhaps that's the real tragedy. Not that Roy Bean existed, but that he was so successful we've turned him into entertainment. Every movie, every tourist visit, every souvenir sold adds another coat of paint over the blood in the floorboards. Take a long, deep breath. Feel the weight of all that mythology, all that carefully constructed legend. Tomorrow, the tourists will come again, cameras ready, eager to capture a piece of the Old West. They'll stand where men were condemned for the crime of being poor or foreign or in the way of progress. They'll laugh at the stories of Bean's eccentricities, his love for an actress who never knew his name. But tonight, in this quiet moment, we can remember the truth, that justice should never be for sale, that the law should never be a performance, and that some men's love stories are really just stories about power dressed up in prettier clothes. The painted eyes of Lily Langtry watch forever from that wall, seeing nothing, understanding less, a goddess of plaster and paint presiding over a kingdom of dust. Roy Bean built her a shrine and called it a courthouse. America built him a legend and called it history. Both were lies, both were true, both were the American way, then, now, and probably forever. As long as there are stories to sell and truth to bury in the desert, where only the scorpions and the tourists dare to tread.